This week on Act Out, UC workers strike but find a foe where the friendlies should be. An unfortunately familiar story. Next up, unemployment rates may be going down, but what does that actually mean? Hint, no, our economy is not doing well. And neither are the soon-to-be homeless elderly of Louisiana because, budget cuts, and also screw grandma. Finally, Alex Cohen of Earth Defense Coalition joins us to talk Puerto Rico, a colony wrestling with both climate change and colonial capitalism, and what aid and autonomy look like on the ground. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out.
Rockets! Brigade! Bulldozers swarm outside the checkpoint gate. A noise flash broke the hush and blew me into the street. I awoke next to the body of my baby. No!
Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. So, first up in news that didn't make the news, last week some 20,000 members of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees Local 3299 went on strike after the University of California system snubbed their complaints over unacceptable wages, healthcare costs, and retirement benefits. In fact, even California lawmakers condemned the UC system's treatment of their low-wage workers, releasing a letter that came out ahead of the strike, pointing out that as the UC system is the recipient of more than $3 billion in taxpayer money, it has a responsibility to, quote, lift up all the boats. But as is so often the case, when it's between a yacht and a rowboat, the yacht gets preferential treatment. The UC system has still not addressed a California state required audit to fix budgeting practices that allowed UC to amass a secret $175 million slush fund while awarding excessive salaries, perks, and golden parachutes to executives. Meanwhile, another state audit showed that UC underpaid contract workers, and new research shows that there are gross pay gaps based on race and gender, particularly as it pertains to the lowest paid workers. Yeah, that strike was a long time coming. Unfortunately, as we've seen in burgeoning fights and strikes across the country, the union elite didn't really want to rock the boat. The yacht, that is. Workers returned to work last Thursday after a 3-day-long strike, and the unions are expected to reach a rather spineless deal that ultimately keeps the workers down and the robber barons afloat. I'm going to keep this metaphor going. As Kayla Costa noted in her reporting for World Socialist website, reflecting the growing militancy of the working class in opposition to the political establishment and union leadership across the U.S., UC workers will find themselves in direct conflict with the unions, UC administrators, and the Democratic Party-dominated state government as they continue the fight for decent jobs, health care, and living conditions. Facing the same conditions as teachers, auto workers, and the entire working class, the health, service, and administrative workers at the University of California must broaden their struggle into a broad political counteroffensive against the repressive and anti-democratic policies of the Democrats, Republicans, and the capitalist system at large. And speaking of workers and capitalism and government bullshit, our next story is about the seemingly good news which suggests that our unemployment rate has fallen to 3.9%. And while that looks really good on the surface, the reality festering beneath this gleaming headline is far more complex and shitty. In a recent report, market analyst Marshall Auerbach outlined the web of lies and misleading data which make employment statistics a lousy benchmark for the health of an economy. First off, unemployment stats have nothing to do with wage growth. In fact, as it happens, our current wage growth is shit, to use a technical term. Secondly, and importantly, unemployment stats are routinely, if not primarily, used to drive policy. And the problem with that is that policy is largely based on less comprehensive measures calculated based on volatile monthly employment data. Figures are based on extrapolations from a relatively small series, and they therefore tend to miss key inflection points, where the economy might suddenly stall if a major financial shock is encountered, such as was the case in 2008. Therefore, no matter what the underlying economic reality is, policymakers and the markets can get a payroll number in any month, or even set of months, that is very misleading. Therefore, in spite of the best efforts of the people working at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, our monetary and fiscal officials are a bit like the proverbial pilot flying without a full complement of engines or navigational equipment. Which is terrifying when you realize that they're flying blind into decisions such as interest rate hikes via higher credit card servicing and more expensive mortgages, higher energy prices, corporate handouts, and cuts to government spending. And did I mention that there's no wage growth? Now, a more comprehensive employment tracking method comes via BED, or Business Enterprise Dynamics, but that takes more time to compile. In fact, as of right now, we only have BED data through the third quarter of 2017. But according to that data, our employment numbers are not as promising as the payroll and household survey numbers, i.e., the numbers that serve our current stats, suggest. Furthermore, employment participation continues to be low, meaning that we have fewer people that are actively looking for work, in part due to low employment prospects. We also have a significant rise in the gig economy, or what's called involuntary part-time work, like Lyft driving, Uber, etc. In fact, a recent study shows that the last time our economy boasted unemployment around 4%, we had 40% less workers in involuntary part-time work. That's a frightening stat when you consider the ramifications of that part-time work, i.e. no benefits such as healthcare, low wages, as in less than $4 an hour low wages, plus all the worker insecurity which stagnates economic growth and mobility. Tack onto that corporate tax cuts and a violent squeezing of everything from healthcare to food stamps, and you have a looming economic disaster. A veritable dollar dung heap crowned with an unemployment statistic made from shoddy data. And speaking of dollar dung heaps, our final headline this week is from Louisiana, where the House of Representatives passed a new budget that could dump tens of thousands of elderly and disabled out onto the streets. The state health department is preparing to notify 37,000 people that due to state budget cuts eliminating 4 Medicaid programs, they could lose their health care coverage, including beds in nursing homes. After the cutting of a 1-cent sales tax in a previous budget, Louisiana now has an $880 million hole in its state coffers. So naturally, the House decided to cut healthcare by $500 million. Earlier this year, Lafayette General Health issued a formal letter warning the state what would happen if neither legislators nor LSU fund the institution. The termination of over 800 hard-working local employees. Termination of graduate medical education, or GME, training programs, disrupting the training process of hundreds of medical students and residents, cessation of all services at university hospital and clinics. The Senate has not yet voted on the budget, and the federal government could technically intervene, but considering public health is one of the Fed's favorite punching bags, that prospect looks bleak at best. Meanwhile, just for reference, a 2017 Oil Change International report shows that Louisiana paid out $322 million in fossil fuel subsidies alone between 2015 and 2016. And by the way, that doesn't include the costs borne by taxpayers for the results of fossil fuel production and consumption. But I agree, let's throw our elderly into the gutters rather than cut corporate payouts or, God forbid, actually make oil and gas companies pay for destroying our planet. Cutting back on support systems for the people has never, doesn't, and will never work. Besides threatening the lives of people in the short term, the long-term effects of this decision can already be seen in cities and towns across the country. The sick and poor become sicker and poorer and die. The economy continues to fall because it's built on the ever-bowing backs of the sick and poor. And the low-life scum at the top will grow richer and fatter till the whole fucking thing collapses.
You low-life scum.
Now, I don't want to slide from one example of the horrors of capitalism straight into the next without giving you some sort of silver lining, a reprieve with a reason to believe that we can do better. So, if you are in Detroit this Friday, May 18th through the 21st, check out the Extreme Energy Extraction Collaborative. Taking place at the multi-use community space, The Commons, this summit will focus on skill and strategy shares, creating collaborative projects, building a collective voice, and strengthening the network across campaigns and issues. To learn more about that, visit stopextremeenergy.org. Also starting this Friday the 18th and going through the 20th is the National Assembly for Black Liberation. And this will take place in Durham, North Carolina. The goal of this assembly is to connect localized efforts so as to build a cohesive national movement for Black liberation. To learn more about that and sign up, visit freedom-manifesto.info. Finally today, we are turning our gaze once again towards Puerto Rico. You may recall from our two-part episode 146 that the situation on the island is still very dire, and that is true today as well. And with hurricane season inching closer every day, the gross lack of government accountability and response becomes more and more serious. And some of you may have heard news from a couple of weeks ago regarding street protests, but as usual, corporate media either altogether censored and ignored it or misrepresented the happenings on the ground. Alex Cohen, co-founder of Earth Defense Coalition, just got back from 4 months on Puerto Rico, where he worked on direct aid and support for those still suffering post-hurricane. He was also at the protests a couple of weeks ago, and his images denote not only brutal policing, but a clear and resolute stance against the austerity measures set forth by the Financial Oversight Board, as well as the wave of school closures that have hit the island in typical shock doctrine fashion. Last week, we sat down with Alex to talk about these protests, the situation on the ground, and the road ahead.
From personal experience, when I first went to Puerto Rico in January, I had no clue of, I had a little bit of a clue, but not a big clue on the debt crisis, the Fiscal Oversight Board and all that, but I went to go because of disaster relief. And and that's what the media was portraying, was the inadequacies of disaster relief and targeting FEMA, which is all good and great. But when I got there on the ground in January, I immediately saw a whole different world that wasn't being portrayed. And since January I got there, there was people protesting, and it was in relation to the Fiscal Oversight Board and the austerity measures imposed by it and the closing of public schools.
So with regards to the fiscal oversight in the public schools, are there demands? Are there any particular things that people are looking for in relation to those issues?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is, for 500 years, they've been denied the right to have any autonomy in the government under which they live. And the Fiscal Oversight Board, an unelected board of 7, was a huge setback in gaining any say in the government under which they live. And so I think ultimately they want sovereignty in controlling their debt. They want have a seat at the table. And what happens with how the debt is handled, and that the United States take responsibility for playing a role in creating it.
So when you say that they want autonomy, would you say that the ultimate goal then is to remove themselves from the United States?
I think the most interesting thing about the Fiscal Control Board is that it's brought people from the different parties together. There's the statehood party, there's the colony party, which are the two ruling class parties in Puerto Rico. One that wants statehood and one that wants to stay the same. The smallest party there is the Independence Party. And so while that might not be the ultimate goal, I think it's bringing to light what the United States is doing and the authority it has without their consent. And so you're seeing people from all different parties that are in the streets protesting the Fiscal Oversight Board.
Gotcha. And one of the things that probably got even mentions of the protests to reach us here is the police brutality, the response. And as far as my research has shown, it's not just this incident. It's a long-standing brutal police entity. Could you talk about what you've seen of that in throughout your time on the island?
Yeah, it's very similar to what people experienced in Ferguson and what people experienced in Standing Rock. Intimidation by federal agents, private mercenaries, as well as the local police. Activists there, share stories about how they're followed, visited by mercenaries, intimidated, and the same tactics we see in the States, but kind of on a different level because it's very isolating for them. To be on this island where the news doesn't get out.
Right. With regards to your work, the aid work that you've been doing, talk a little bit. I understand that you had not planned to stay there, as long as you ended up staying there. Can you talk a little bit about the aid work that you were doing there?
Yeah, we were doing, all types of distribution from water filters to distributing, stockpiled FEMA supplies that were sitting in warehouses, getting that out to the people. Our main goal at that point was getting all the stuff that was sitting in the warehouses into the hands of the people as hurricane season was approaching. So from solar energy stuff to anything really that was there donated and sitting just waiting to be taken to the people.
And going back to the autonomy issue, are a lot of the aid initiatives trying to decouple people from the government on the island, which, as I understand it, is quite corrupt?
Yeah, I think especially with things like solar and permaculture, things that, you know, the local Puerto Rican people were taking it upon themselves to ask for solar solutions, taking it upon themselves to ask for, rebuilding in cement instead of wood, asking to find their own water solutions, like, having community wells dug up and just starting to repair power lines themselves. So I think disaster relief, what we saw was the true spirit of the Puerto Rican people, which was, this fight for autonomy, whether that extends to independence in a broader sense, but the understanding that self-determination is the solution and that they can't rely on the government anymore.
And has there been any government response that you've dealt with personally? Like, has the government commented or done anything otherwise with regards to, this type of aid work that isn't attached to FEMA, that isn't attached to the Red Cross?
I think they're watching. Um, and, there's a lot of independent groups that have formed that are not related to FEMA or any of those things. And I think they watch closely. And we were able to access, FEMA contracted warehouse to get supplies out and stuff like that. But in terms of listening to active, one of the biggest independent, thoughts on the ground was the inadequacies of FEMA's policy that states you have to have a deed, your name has to be on a deed to get rebuilding money. The reason it's taking Puerto Rico so long to rebuild is because it's a totally different culture than that of the 50 states. And so when the land was being traded and given, people didn't have deeds. They just shook each other's hand and that was it. Or your family property was passed down. And there was just no exchange of a title or anything like that. So FEMA literally denied those people, and people are still in their second, third, and fourth appeals to try and get rebuilding money. Now, that was kind of a big focus of a lot of disaster relief activists and people on the ground to get that part changed. And last I heard is that FEMA was considering it, but there hasn't been any large changes in relation to that.
And with regards then to the people's response, what has the response been from people that you've worked with on the ground in terms of your aid versus government aid?
When we go into communities, one of the first things we say is we're not FEMA, and the trust level already goes up. And so people from all varying, political beliefs or whatever, FEMA has left a very bad taste in their mouth, and I think overall the United States has. And so people weren't necessarily super surprised that, the disaster relief was not strong from the United States because they're used to being neglected by the colonial ruler.
And in terms of what you've seen, what do you think the trajectory will be now? Like as you mentioned, we're gearing up for another hurricane season, and after the violent blowback against protesters, what do you see? What do you suspect will happen on the ground there?
I don't know, and it's a very interesting time to be there in Puerto Rico because what was happening before the hurricane was, encampments in front of the federal courthouse and thousands of people in the streets at least 5 times a week, demanding an end to the fiscal control board. And this was signed into law by Barack Obama in 2015, and the people have been rising up against it. And Maria really pacified them just because of the need to survive and get back on their feet. And the saddest thing, as usual, is that the United States and the Fiscal Control Board is not only failing at providing adequate disaster relief to American citizens, but is using this to kick them while they're down to push forward the austerity measures. And I think the biggest thing on Puerto Ricans' mind right now, based on the movement and what's happening in the streets, is the closure of 280 public schools, the slashing of pensions, the reduction of the federal minimum wage in Puerto Rico alone. And so the diaspora, the increasing amount of Puerto Ricans to the States is going up, and all these investors are ready to come in and take their spot. There's over 5 million Puerto Ricans in the States and 3 million on the island of Puerto Rico, and that number is supposed to keep going up.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, this issue of, it's the shock doctrine. As soon as one of these natural disasters hits, the privatization starts, and the selling off of land starts as well. Is that something that you've seen either in person or have heard about? These big tycoons coming in and buying up beach properties or things like that.
It's 100% happening, and Brock Pierce and his cryptocurrency cult are moving in on that currently right now, and they've been holding big conferences and scoping out land to kind of build their crypto empire. On top of that, the charter schools are ready to come in. The closing of 280 public schools is specifically so charter can get an arm up. And it's all moving very quick. The governor and the fiscal control board is pushing these things along really quick. And, you talk to people on the ground, the activists on the ground, and this has to stop. I mean, this island will be uninhabitable for Puerto Ricans. And it will just be, a tourist attraction for people in the States. And that's a huge fear with the people on the ground right now there.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that that people don't think of immediately, because when I was there, something that I was really struck by was that I didn't see a lot of high rises on the water, not in the places that I was. They're completely untouched and gorgeous expanses of nature that could so easily be destroyed by capitalist interests. So
yeah.
It is super important to protect that. What would be your recommendation to people here in the continental United States in terms of helping and supporting in solidarity?
I think the biggest thing, before I went to Puerto Rico just 4 months ago, I knew very little. I didn't realize that 3 million American citizens didn't get a vote for their president. They didn't have a voting member to represent them in Washington, D.C. Up until the mid 1900s, their governor was appointed by the United States. I mean, America's last colony structured this way still exists, and it's in complete disaster state and was far before Maria. And so I think I would really recommend people read The War Against All Puerto Ricans. And reading that book and just educating ourselves about what's happening in America's colony. And from there, I think that people would be inspired to take action, finding groups that are on the ground now, supporting them. Solidarity protests, something I talked about with activists on the ground, was the need to go back to the States and try and help organize speaking tours and maybe getting, local activists flown over to the States, organizing solidarity protest. Congress passed PROMESA. They can change PROMESA. They can, Section 210 of it, the federal government removes themselves of all liability of the debt, while in the same stroke imposes this unelected Board of Seven to have everything to do with managing the debt. So it's our federal government that's, the puppet master pulling the strings here, and we have got to take responsibility and stand up and fight it.
Would you recommend that people go there to help, or would that just turn into what is frequently looked at as volunteer tourism?
I think it's still an interesting question I've been thinking about. The people I've met are open to, people coming to help, and, the disaster reliefs, and for some reason, disaster relief and activism always seems to be like two separate worlds, one ruled by like ex-cops and military personnel, the disaster relief angle, and then the activism, activists, left-wing activists. And so it was interesting because in Puerto Rico, there was a lot of crossover. And I think that scared a lot of people in power. But I think people should go there and help, but I guess it's not really my position to say on that.
What was it specifically that pulled you there?
Well, I am the co-founder of an organization called Earth Defense Coalition, and we do intersectional environmental direct action, and we had been wanting to draw the parallels of not just fighting, systems that create, oppression, but the hospitality side of things, and linking increased hurricane activity to, increased need for just disaster relief. So that brought me to go to Puerto Rico, where it seemed the most vulnerable were affected, to do disaster relief.
For more information on Alex and his work, check out facebook.com/Earth Defense Coalition. And that will do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Thank you so much for watching. Please spread and share this with all of your friends, foes, and people you don't know. Again, check out the last slide and the show description to find sites and URLs that we mentioned in this week's show. And for interim updates as well as posted videos, images, and articles, visit us on social media. And to those who have donated, thank you so much. Please keep spreading the word in order to ensure our ability to keep acting out. From the Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, visit patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some rocks to throw. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left for nothing, motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been backing up inch by inch, we got nowhere else to go. It's been too many years since you pushed and shoved my shove. I'm not a violent man.